Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Shavani and I'm a second year natural sciences student at Girton College, Cambridge. Today I'm joined by Dr. Catherine Sumnall and she's going to be answering pretty much all the most frequently answered questions relating to Cambridge interviews. So without any further ado, Catherine, would you like to introduce yourself?
I'd love to. Thank you so much. And thank you very much for inviting me to come and join in with this today. I really appreciate it. So my name's Catherine Sumnall. I'm the admissions director at Sidney Sussex College, and I've been in that role for 5 years now. So I'm quite experienced as an admissions director, and I'll be able to answer the questions that Shavani is posing to us that relate to all the kinds of concerns that you might have about interviews so far. I'm a geographer by academic background, and so lots of the interviews that I've done over the past 12 years as a director of studies in geography have been in that subject, but I also interview across a wide range of subjects too.
Thank you so much, Catherine. So let's jump right into the question. So question number one, Cambridge is my dream university and I did not receive an interview invite. How do I feel better about myself?
This is a really understandable question. And I completely empathise with people who may be feeling this way, having recently received the news that they've sadly not been invited to interview. What I would say is that the application process to Cambridge is a very competitive one. On average, the university receives about 20,000 applications. And for each place at the university, there's usually about 5 applications, sometimes in some subjects up to 10. That means that there can be really, really competitive courses. And what we try to do when we're deciding who to call for interview is to look very carefully at all the information that we have so far about the things you've provided in your application, about the things that are in your teacher reference, about your qualifications to date, about any pre-interview assessment, if you've taken a pre-interview assessment, and to use that really to decide whether, if we called you for interview, you would be competitive. And we know it can be really disappointing to receive the news that you're not called for interview. We know that it's a big sort of part of the process and you've been steeling yourself for that invitation and that process. We tend to think that it is kinder in the long run if we know that your application at this stage is not going to be competitive, not to put you through that interview process. And we hope that you'll be able to reflect on your application and understand that decision in the context of the really competitive nature of admission to the university. I would say, though, we are really fortunate as a university that all of our applications come from really very strong students. So if you've made an application to the university in the first place, please believe me that you will be very happy and successful at another top university. We really will feel that will be just as much of a success as if you'd come to join us in Cambridge. So I know it's disappointing. I know it can be really hard to get that letter or that email from the college that you've applied to or have been allocated to. I guess it's important for you to process that disappointment. That's a really valid and important emotion for you to feel. But please do be aware that in the long run, your life will be happy and successful too.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Question number 2, I have my interview coming up soon and I'm feeling really nervous. Any tips for pre-interview anxiety?
That's a really good question. So the first thing I'd say is that the interview is one part of our admissions process. As I just explained when we were talking about the people who sadly were not invited to interview, we're very lucky that you provide us with a lot of information during the admissions process. You provide us with your application, and on your application form, we have your grades to date. We have your predicted grades if you're still taking qualifications. We have your personal statement. We have the things that your teachers or college say about you in your reference. We have any test performances. We have any written work. We have a lot of information. The interview really is one extra piece of information within that wider jigsaw puzzle of trying to put together a picture of you as an applicant for the course. So the first thing I'd say, probably the top tip I can give you, is remember that the interview is one part of a process. And we will always look at it in the context of everything else that you've provided us with, just as we do at every other stage in the process. The second thing I'd say is it's completely normal to feel a bit apprehensive before your interview. It may well be that you've not been interviewed for anything before. It may also be that this is the first time you've had the opportunity to have an academic conversation with people in your subject who have spent a bit of time studying it and are researching in it. That's completely normal to feel a little bit unnerved about going into that situation. And we as interviewers are very, very aware that you might be feeling a little bit nervous and a little bit apprehensive. And we certainly take that into account when we're considering your performance. So in terms of things that you can do to sort of calm yourself down, try and take a couple of deep breaths before you go into your virtual interview room. Do the kinds of things that will calm you down, whether that's maybe writing a few things down in terms of stuff that will allow you to contextualize this process in a wider process of applying to university, almost an affirmation, if you will, but also just techniques for staying calm in an unusual situation. I have to say that the overwhelming majority of interviews go really well. That candidates are not, completely, they don't find their performance completely sort of thrown off by feeling nervous. You tend to settle into it when you get into the interview room and the interviewers introduce themselves and you get going with the questions. So try and find some techniques to calm yourself down before you come into the room. But remember, it's one part of a process. Remember that we understand that you're likely to be nervous and do have faith in the fact that you'll get into it and it'll be absolutely fine.
I think that definitely is very reassuring. Thank you, Catherine. And I think a part of just feeling anxious about something is overthinking every tiny detail. And this is a question that I myself have wondered, and I get asked this a lot, but what do you wear to an interview?
Oh, that's a really good question. So, I'm also prone to overthinking, so I sympathise with that particular perspective. There is absolutely no dress code for an interview. You can wear whatever you feel comfortable in. Now, if you would feel comfortable in dressing up for an interview, and if that would make you feel as though you were playing the part, that's absolutely fine. Equally, if you want to wear jeans and a t-shirt and you're comfortable in that, that's absolutely fine as well. We're not assessing you on your appearance. We wouldn't dream of doing that. That would be entirely against the whole ethos of our process. So just wear something that you feel comfortable in. It's simply not part of the assessment.
Awesome. Question number 4, how do I prepare for my interview? And how important are work experiences, internships, or further reading?
That's really good questions. And I'll take it in 2 parts, if I may. So if I can deal with the sort of work experience for the reading elements first. So when you were making your applications and when you were putting together your personal statements, you will have done things to support your interest in your subject, things that we tend to describe with a term called supercurricular engagement, which simply means doing things outside your school curriculum that support your academic interests. And that can be really wide-ranging. That can be, in some circumstances, work experience, or work experience is not required for most of our subjects. That can be further reading, and that's probably the most common thing that we see, particularly on the arts, humanities and social sciences side, but actually across all of our subjects, students have often done a little bit of extra reading in topics that interest them. But it could also be podcasts, it could be YouTube videos, it could be lectures that you've gone to, it could be MOOCs that you've done. It really is very, very diverse. If you've done those things as part of your application and you've written about them at your personal statement, it's possible that you might be asked to talk about them at interview. So it's a really good idea to move on to the second part of the question, to look over again the kinds of things that you did in your application to remind yourself what it was that you wrote and what it was that you thought about your subject, because your interviewers may well ask you questions based on your personal statement. There is a certain amount of variety between subjects, so it's probably more common to have a discussion about a personal statement in an interview in the arts, humanities and social sciences than it is to have an extensive discussion in a STEM subject, where there might be a little bit of discussion about your personal statement, but there also might not be. So don't worry either way if it doesn't come up. But one certainly good idea is to refresh your memory about what it was that you wrote and were interested in, and have a little think and get yourself back into the process for talking through those interests. Your interview really is an opportunity for the people who are interviewing you to ask you questions that are related to your subject, to see how you think through things that are relevant in terms of skills and in terms of knowledge that to the topic you want to do at university. So it might be a good idea to have a look through some recent school or college work, just to remind yourself of the kinds of techniques for study and for doing things that you've been doing, in case those crop up. It's also a good idea to have a little think about the kinds of skills that we might be trying to get at during an interview process. So on the STEM side of things, that might be problem solving. So it might be a good idea to look at some online resources. We can put some online resources in the sort of the links under this video to maybe have a look at some problem sets. So things like Isaac Physics are really good for interviews in natural sciences. Things like the Further Mathematics Support Programme are really good for thinking about interviews in mathematics. Things like I Want to Study Engineering are really good for problems in engineering. Have a little look at the resources that you might find online and maybe work through some of those problems. And one really top tip for sort of doing that in an interview context is to try and speak your thoughts, because that's probably the most unusual thing that you'll be asked to do in an interview. You're all really good, I have no doubt, at sort of solving problems and doing things with a piece of paper or with a computer in front of you. Perhaps the slight difference in technique in an interview situation is that we want to see the way you think. So we want to sort of have you explain that process to us. So do be prepared to sort of talk through your reasoning and the steps that you're taking as you approach those problems. On the arts, humanities, social sciences side of things, it's more common perhaps to have something like a text or an unseen prompt material that could be really wide-ranging in terms of what it is to look at as part of the interview process. And that might happen in advance of the interview. So you might have some time to look at it before the interview, or it might happen during the interview, in which case you'll sort of be given a little bit of time to process that information during the interview. So practice doing things like that. Practice having a look at unseen resources, whether they're texts related to your subject, whether they're graphs or maps or pictures or short pieces of translation or poems, or really the list is endless. And see if you can respond to and offer a description, but also then offer an analysis of what you've been presented with. And that should give you a bit of confidence for the kinds of skills that you'll then be developing when you go into the interview.
Yeah, I think, as you said, I'll definitely try and link as many resources as I can down the description box below. I think this leads me on to the next question. How are interviews usually structured? I know you've covered a bit, but are there any significant differences between science and humanities interview, both in terms of how they're structured as well as how interviewees might answer or like strategize between science and humanities?
Again, that's a really good question. So if I'll sort of start by sort of talking through the basics of what an interview looks like, and then I'll sort of come on to your really good point about the sort of differences between subjects. So depending on the college that you've applied to or been allocated to, there may be some differences in terms of the sort of format of the interview, in terms of how long it might be scheduled to last, the platform that it might be taking place on, and how many other interviewers are in the room. Now, they are differences in the structure of the interview, but they're not differences in the purpose of the interview or really in the style of the interview. We're all trying to get at the same thing. It's just that colleges sometimes have different approaches to getting at that same point. So don't worry if your interview schedule looks slightly different to maybe someone else that you know who's applying for the same subject at a different college. It's still trying to get at the same point. But it is a really good idea to make sure that you know the arrangements for the college that you are applying to in advance of the day of the interview. And often colleges will be putting on in the next couple of weeks opportunities for you to test your technology and make sure that you're familiar with the platforms that are being used. If, for instance, you're needing to use a tablet for writing on the screen, then maybe there'll be opportunities for you to sort of test that out and make sure that you can use it. And it's a really good idea to get to grips with doing that. Do look at the university web pages as well, because there are some resources there on how to deal with an online interview. And again, it's a slightly different process to sort of being face-to-face in a room with someone, but we're still trying to get at the same ultimate goal. In terms of differences between subjects, there are differences between subjects. Applying to, a degree in classics is very much not the same as a degree in mathematics. We still want to choose the strongest students. We still want to choose those with the greatest academic potential, but the way in which we will assess that potential through the interview will inevitably differ because the subjects differ too. So we're still trying to get at the same kinds of things. We're still trying to take you a little bit outside your comfort zone and give you some information that maybe you haven't encountered before, and see how you apply knowledge and skills that you do already have to this new context. So that kind of approach is common across all of the subjects in the university. If you were applying for an arts and humanities subject, chances are we might try and do that through something that's relevant to the subject that you're then going to go on and study. So if, for example, you might want to study history, it's very possible that we will give you a source to look at during the interview, or maybe shortly before the interview. Now, as a historian, you're probably fairly comfortable with looking at sources as part of your studies so far. So it's nothing sort of dramatically different in terms of the skills we're requiring of you. And it's also nothing dramatically sort of off-piste compared to the kinds of things that you would be doing as an undergraduate historian. We just want to see how you approach that, how you deconstruct it, how you make sense of it, how you analyze it, how you describe it, how you respond to questions that are based on it. And they don't require you to have particular knowledge of the source that you've been given, or even the period that you've been given, for an example like that. But we want you to take your sort of skills as a historian and then make sense of this new thing that we know is going to be unfamiliar to you. And watching you make sense of something that's unfamiliar is how we see those sort of thought processes in action. So that's an example for an arts and humanities subject. You can sort of transfer those same principles to other arts and humanities subjects too. On the sciences and maths and engineering and technology side of things, we're more likely to structure the interview around problems. So they, again, vary according to the particular discipline that you're interested in. If you're going into a mathematics interview, you should certainly be prepared to be doing maths for most of the interview. So there may well be less opportunity for doing that sort of discursive exploration of ideas within your personal statement. It may still happen, but it also might not. But it's certain that we will be giving you mathematical problems to look at within the interview and looking at how you solve them. And it's quite likely that we'll start from a basis that we think you might know already. So something that you can then sort of solve and deal with and explain. And then we'll probably steadily increase the complexity of that problem until we get to a point where actually it is difficult and is new. Because again, we're trying to get at that moment where we can see you apply knowledge that you have to an unfamiliar situation. And it's in taking you outside of your comfort zone, whether that's through using an unfamiliar prompt or whether that's through asking you a sort of a question that gets progressively harder, that we try and achieve that. So that will give you a little bit of an insight into the sort of the differing structures of the interview. They obviously vary a little bit. You know, you're not necessarily, you can't predict the questions that will come up, but that's the kind of ultimate goal of what we're trying to do.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And I noticed that you touched upon the online interviews that are happening this year and have been happening last year as well. I just wanted to ask, do you have any online interview specific tips? And can't we just refer to our notes or Google things if we don't know?
Aha! So this is really good. So online interviews are a little bit different, I suppose, in the way they feel to candidates than actually being in a room in person with someone interviewing you. And in many respects, this might be quite good because rather than coming into an environment that is unfamiliar and wondering about where the room is and interviews take place in December, and so how many layers of clothing you might need to progress successfully around the college, that sort of stuff is taken out of your hands. You'll be in an environment that's familiar to you, whether that's your home or whether that's your school, and you will have that kind of interaction in a sort of familiar space that hopefully feels very, very secure and has provides you with some degree of comfort. So actually doing an online interview can feel a little bit sort of stilted. I know that over the last couple of years, everyone has got more familiar with online platforms than they ever thought would be possible. And we all know from online interactions that they can sometimes feel a little bit stilted. It's harder to read body language. It's harder to sort of know when to start talking, when to stop talking, how to interrupt, how to do all of those things that are so natural in a normal conversation. The thing I would say is don't worry. We're all experiencing that sort of sense of dislocation that's part of being interviewed online. We are all aware of how to use our online platforms and how to sort of ask questions that allow you to showcase the skills that we want you to showcase specifically in an online environment. So we design our interviews around this platform. So it should, in that sort of technical sense, be smooth, and you shouldn't encounter any problems. But if you do feel it a sort of slightly socially awkward encounter, don't worry about it. Your interviewers will do their best to sort of make you feel at ease when you come into the virtual room. And they'll also sort of provide some of that kind of interview management process around. So they'll tell you when to move on to the next thing. They'll give you some guidance, they'll give you some prompts, they'll give you some hints. So don't worry about it in that sense. In terms of having stuff next to you to look at during an interview, that would not be something that I would recommend. An interview is not a test of your knowledge. I know that feels like it's on kind of sort of an uncomfortable and slightly strange thing to say. It's not an exam that you would go into and write on a piece of paper or type on a laptop. So it's not requiring you to sort of recall knowledge in that sense. So having something on a piece of paper or being able to Google something, actually, I think would probably disrupt the degree to which you would then be able to answer the question that you've been asked. No one is expecting you to sort of recall vast amounts of knowledge and then recite them back. We're just asking you to answer our questions. And if you can't quite remember something, then say you can't quite remember something. And your interviewers will be glad to prompt you, because again, it's not a test of your knowledge. It's a test of how you think and how you construct arguments or how you solve problems and how you think critically. So don't have reams of notes next to you to sort of leaf through, because you just won't have time in the interview situation and it could distract you from answering the question. But also don't be afraid to say, I know I've done this. I know I remember this. I can't quite remember. Could you remind me? And your interviewers will be happy to do so. That won't be a problem at all.
I think this definitely gives me flashbacks back to my interview when I forgot the most simple things that, I don't know, I just thought everyone should know and I just blanked out. But my interviewer was very, very sweet. And I felt like the more I told him I didn't understand certain things, or I forgot this tiny thing that I know is in my head, but I can't access it, the more he was able to guide me in the right direction and get me towards the harder questions that I was able to prove that I can think for myself.
I think that's such fantastic advice, Shavani. I think that the way you've spoken that through is really valuable for sort of giving people an insight into what the interviewer's role is within an interview. So that's fantastic.
Yeah, precisely. Speaking of interviewers, does it make a difference who the interviewer is? And is it advisable to research the background of my interviewer?
Okay. So it doesn't make a difference to what we're trying to do within an interview. It doesn't make a difference to the outcome of your interview. And it doesn't make a difference to the kinds of questions that, the kinds of questions and approaches we will do within an interview. Interviewers, obviously, like people, like candidates, are different. We differ in terms of our own personalities, the kinds of things that we find interesting academically. But ultimately, the interview isn't about us. It's about you as the candidate. We're all set up to try and find out about you, and everything that we construct within the interview is to try and get at the way you think, the way you approach things. Nothing, I mean, really, we're incidental to this process. We're just facilitating it in that sense. And interviewers all have to take part in training to make sure that we have a common approach and a common understanding of what purpose the interview has and how it fits within our wider admission selection process. So who is interviewing you doesn't make a difference to the importance of the interview. It doesn't make a difference to the kind of point of the interview. And although, different people interact in different ways, it only on that level will it influence your sort of experience of an interview. People often do research so when you get your invitation to interview, you may well also receive the names of the people who will be interviewing you. And often people then do look up the people who are going to be interviewing them. I think it probably gives them a sense of comfort, something about what this person is and does and means. That's absolutely fine. If that does give you a sense of comfort, if it does help you in your preparations to just feel more secure in the environment that you're then going into, please feel free to do that. Probably don't suddenly magically develop a profound research interest in the same thing that the person who's interviewing you has an interest in. It's, again, the interview is not about the interviewer, it's about the candidate. We're interested in your enthusiasms, your motivations, your approach to your subject, not ours. And we're more than capable of deciding whether your approach is genuine or authentic to you as well. So just be yourselves, really. Knowing something about the interviewer's research interests does not allow you to answer their questions better. Because our questions are not, our assessment of your answers is not going to be based around whether you have read our papers or whether you sort of know something about our particular specialist subject. It's not about that at all. So just be yourselves and be authentic, and genuine about the kinds of things you were interested in, because that's what we want to know about.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I think that'll definitely hit home. The next question is, I'm so scared about completely blanking out in an interview. What do I do if this happens?
Yeah, okay. So I understand that fear. In all my years of interviewing, I have only ever seen it happen once. So it is actually really, 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 really rare for anyone to find themselves in this situation within an interview. So the first thing I would say is, don't worry, it is really, 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 really unlikely to happen. If it does happen, we as interviewers are prepared to deal with all kinds of things that might go amiss within an interview. And probably the thing that we will do is to give you a chance to compose yourself, to say, have a drink of water, take a moment to collect your thoughts. We'll just sort of keep quiet for a second while you do that. And almost invariably, that will be fine. That will be all the candidate needs to be able to get their thoughts back on track and then continue very well with the interview. So if that happens, that's absolutely fine. It is in the very, 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 very unlikely event that an interview can't continue, then we'll make the admissions office and the admissions tutor aware in the college that you've applied to, and every attempt will be made to reschedule an assessment for a later point. But it is really, 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 really unusual. What can often happen, though, actually on a sort of a slightly less dramatic level, is that maybe people forget the question they've been asked because it's been quite a long question, or because you're feeling a bit nervous or under pressure, and it just goes completely out of your head. That's totally fine. That happens all the time. Just say to the interviewer, I'm really sorry, I can't remember the first part of your question, or I'm really sorry, could you just repeat that for me? Or would you mind rephrasing this so I can make sure I've understood it correctly? So all of these different kinds of things are actually a good reason to do interviews in the first place, because they are sort of an exercise in communication in many respects. And we want to make sure first and foremost that we're talking about the same things. So we can't assess you if we don't know that we're talking about the same things. If you don't remember the question, or if you don't understand a word in the question, or if you can't remember a definition of something, that's not part of the test. The test is the thinking. So don't be afraid to ask for clarification. Don't be afraid to ask for thinking time if you need it. That's absolutely fine. And I should also say, if you require extra time for any reason in assessments that are made of you at school, perhaps you have a disability or medical condition that requires that, your college will have been in touch to ask for those arrangements, and we will respect those arrangements within the interview as well. So to give you processing time to sort of think through these issues too.
Thank you, Catherine. And along the same lines, what happens if I get things wrong during an interview? Is it okay? And what usually is the interviewer's response to this?
That's a really good question. And I understand it's something that applicants can really worry about. So an interview is not a test of your knowledge. An interview is not the same as sitting down with a paper exam or an online exam and filling in the answers. An interview is sort of a much more discursive, two-way conversation. And so you shouldn't worry about getting things wrong in an interview. People get things wrong all the time in conversation in everyday life. The undergraduates that I teach, I, as the teacher, often get things wrong. And the point that you take away from that is not so much the fact that you've got things wrong, but the way in which you recover from that, the way in which you take on board the correction that's then provided to you and sort of run with that. And the degree with which you can then sort of reflect on maybe where things went wrong, because that can often be an interesting thought process to sort of go through. And I'll give you some examples to make that a bit more concrete. So for instance, if you were in an arts and humanities or social sciences interview and you misunderstood something in a resource that you were given, perhaps you were given a graph to look at and you misread the scale. That happens often. And really being able to read the scale on the graph is not the point of having given you the graph in the first place. We want to really get to sort of how you interpret the data in the graph, what kinds of analysis we then might subsequently build into the material that you've then been given. So making a mistake like that is absolutely not problematic at all. Your interviewers will likely say, do you want to look again at this? And we'll sort of check that we're talking about the same things. And that's fine, no problem at all. So you're then sort of taking on board the correction, moving on with other things. Maybe in a sort of a sciences interview, maybe you simply get a solution to a problem wrong. That's generally unproblematic in many respects, because it's not normally the solution that we're after, but the way in which you got to that solution, which is why it's always a good idea to have gone through that process that I spoke about earlier of saying what you see and outlining your thought process as you go through solving the problem. Because often then your interviewer might step in and see that you're going to go wrong and try and guide you in a different path in the first place. But if you do ultimately go wrong, they'll have understood how you went wrong. And you can often go wrong in really interesting ways. And that's often a really good insight into how you're thinking and how you're pulling together information too. So in short, don't worry about going wrong. On a sort of a related note, interviewers might disagree with you during an interview, and that doesn't mean that you've got something wrong. It just means that they're trying to challenge you to think about a problem from another perspective. And that might happen in terms of them asking you to put forward an alternative argument to the one that you've already expressed, or that might be asking you to think of a more elegant solution to a problem that you've already solved. Both of those things are corrections of a sort, but they're also invitations for you to show a different way of thinking and a sort of intellectual flexibility that is a helpful skill to have across the sort of degrees that we offer.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I think now being an undergrad at university, I definitely understand that so many of these are just components of having an intellectual conversation with someone. And it's not a binary yes or no or right or wrong, but it's more, as you explained, just the journey towards widening your perspective and being open to contradictory perspectives or how you digest new information. And I think just a year later, I'm able to understand so much more, which even I didn't understand when I was doing my interview. And I just thought it's going to be like, I'm going to get things wrong, or they're going to be right, and they're going to say that I got things wrong. But it's just completely, that's not the point.
Exactly. And I'm so pleased that that's the experience that you've had a year later. That really sort of reaffirms the point. That's great.
I think this, again, sort of a related question, but what are interviewers ultimately trying to assess, and what are they looking for in candidates?
Again, this is a really excellent and sort of central question. Interviews are, I suppose one good way to think of them is sort of oral aptitude tests. So they are interactive. You will be talking, the interviewers will be talking, there will be a back and forth in that. We will be asking you questions that are related to your subject, that really try and get at the skills that you need to be a successful undergraduate in that subject. And the way we get at those skills is not by testing your knowledge, but by looking at how you think through things. Those things vary. Those things vary from subject to subject. Those things vary from sort of the kinds of skill that we're trying to get at. So there's sort of no one approach to an interview that I can outline and say your interview will be like this. But I can say that your interview will be really trying to get at asking you to think through newish things, maybe unfamiliar things, not completely out there things that you would never have encountered before or have no clue about, but things that are maybe unfamiliar, things that maybe you haven't thought about in detail before. And they'll be related, and we'll think that you can think through these problems because we wouldn't be asking you these questions if we didn't think that you could. We're not looking for particular answers in response to those problems, but we are looking for the ways in which you take what you already know from all the stuff you've done at school, from all of the super curricular engagement that you spent so much time on in advance of your application, and how you digest this information and make it relevant and use it to make sense of new information and new scenarios and new problems and new prompts that you've been given. So interviews are an assessment of your skills for your subject, also your motivation for study and your willingness to sort of keep going and be resilient when people are asking you questions. You may not necessarily be getting everything completely right, but that's not the point. The point is how you then take on the correction and sort of make sense of the information that you've then been given in correction to go forward. So hopefully that gives you an insight into what interviewers are looking for. We're also looking at the whole of the rest of your file. So we have plenty of other information about you too.
Thank you, Catherine. This is a very interesting question to follow. So different students have different personalities. Some may come across as more introverted, but they're able to express their enthusiasm about their subject on paper, while other students can more easily convey their enthusiasm about their subject overtly. So, does the personality of the student matter in an interview?
This is such an excellent question. And I really appreciate having the chance to talk it through because as interviewers, often, as people who have been selected to be academics and gone through academic processes, we're often quite introverted and shy as well. So it's really helpful to have the chance to showcase that it is not about how you say something, it is about what you say that we're really, really interested in. I'm trying to think of it as sort of a way of phrasing this that really works in a virtual setting. So the way in which I tend to express this when I'm talking about personality and in-person interviews is that you can be the kind of person who stands up in front of a room and is really confident and declaims like they're a brilliant actor, or you can be the kind of person who looks at their shoes when you're delivering an answer. And neither of those things matter because it is about the content of what you are saying that we're going to pick up on and ask you questions about. In an online setting, I suppose it's a bit different because it's not so easy to sort of make eye contact and develop those distinctions. But your personality will still show through. But we're really not assessing you on your personality. There's no kind of personality type that is more successful or less successful as an undergraduate. We're really looking at your academic ability and your academic potential, and that is it. That is all we are interested in. So don't worry if you're shy. Also, don't worry if you're confident. Neither of those things are negatives. They're just who you are.
I think that definitely is very reassuring because obviously right now in my cohort, there's a wide range of students with varying personalities. And of course, we're all studying the same course with the same potential and the same success. So I think, yeah, it is a very, very good point to drive home. As an international student, I had my interview back home earlier, like around October and November. Yeah. But I know that most home students and who choose to come to Cambridge or are applying for the Cambridge application season have their interviews in like December. So what are the differences between being interviewed by the international panel that happens earlier in the year and the college panel that usually happens in Cambridge or happens in December?
Again, this is a really very, very good question. International interviews have sort of long been a part of Cambridge's admissions process. And generally, it's been a way to enable international students to access interviews that don't require them to travel hundreds, thousands of miles. Now, obviously, that's a little bit different in an online world, but the system still remains in place because we have a significant amount of expertise in our international interviewing team that are very used to assessing qualifications from the areas that they specialise in. So in terms of how the interviews differ between the international interviews, which tend to take place a little bit earlier, and the December interviews that take place by the college, it's a very straightforward answer. They're not trying to do different things. They just happen at different times. They might be structured slightly differently. So more commonly as an international, if you're doing the international panel, you might have one interview. Whereas if you're having a college panel, you might have one or two or three interviews, depending on what your college happens to do for its applicants. But they're not trying to do different things. They're all trying to get at the same skill set. The questions are available, the report forms are available to colleges in advance of that sort of process of the international interviews taking place. And then they're also really useful and formative to us as we're thinking about interviews and the gathered field within colleges and across subjects in December as well. So it makes no difference. It is simply a practical arrangement to enable the most students to be seen for interview.
Thank you, Catherine. I think it's great that the university is thinking of accessibility when it comes to interviews, because obviously that is very important when you're on the different side of the globe.
Yeah, exactly.
So our final question is, I feel like I've messed up my interview and I can't stop thinking about it. Any tips for post-interview anxiety?
This is another excellent question. And I suppose it comes back to the answer I gave right at the start, which is that the interview is one part of the admissions process in your college and across the university. So it will never be the only thing that is looked at in making a decision. So you might feel as though your interview went absolutely terribly, but it might actually be First of all, that it didn't, because I tend to find that applicants are not terribly good at assessing their own performance. It's often really tempting and common on a sort of an individual basis to think about the things you did wrong rather than the things you did well. And I've done that in interviews, from my own undergraduate admissions interview right the way through to job interviews. You always focus on the negatives. Often you've given a much more successful picture than you think you have. Even though if your interview didn't go as well as you think it could have done or should have done, it's never going to be the only thing that factors into decision making. It is just one part along with everything else that you've provided us with. And I suppose one thing to be aware of is that to my great sort of regret, we do end up having to say no to most of the people who make an application to us. It is a very competitive process at a highly selective university. And ultimately, we'll admit around 3,000 students out of the 20,000 plus that made an application to us. That means that, you have to be in it to win it. You have to make an application to be one of those 3,000 that are ultimately offered a place. But there is going to be a lot of disappointed people who really wanted to come to Cambridge, and in many cases would probably have been quite successful at Cambridge that we simply don't have space for within our university. So when you're thinking about the admission selection process in general, do be aware that there is a possibility that you might not be made an offer at the end of it. And in no way should you regard that as a failure. In no way is that something that reflects badly on you as an individual, or your schooling, or an error that you have made in the interview, or your qualifications, or your personal statement, or your test, or anything else like that. It is simply the case that against a gathered field, we did not find your application as competitive as some others. And it also does not mean that you won't be tremendously successful at another excellent university. Cambridge is not the only place in this country or in the world. There are many really, really, really excellent universities where you will thrive and succeed at the highest level. So see it as part of a process. We really hope that even though you may not be successful at the end of it, we hope you find it positive. We hope you find it useful to have this sort of academic engagement with an interview. We hope you enlightening for the studies that you then go on and do later, that you've had to go through this process of thinking through the kinds of things that you wanted to do to support your interest in your subject, right the way through to talking about them at interview. We really do want to make it the most useful experience that it can be. So even if you don't get an offer at the end of it, please still regard your application as having been successful, because it is, because you've applied.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I think we have come to the end of our FAQs session, and I just wanted to ask if you have any final tips and words of encouragement to anyone who is going to be sitting an interview soon.
I'd love to, and I'd also love to ask you for your own tips in a moment as well, because I suspect you've got some really useful insights too. So in terms of things I'll start with the things that maybe you don't need to do in an interview. So things that I wouldn't necessarily think that they're not sort of massive traps to avoid, but they are things that maybe are not so helpful with an interview experience. Probably the most common thing people do is that they don't answer the question that they've actually been asked. They answer a different question, the one that they wish they'd been asked, the one that they spent an hour preparing a little speech on prior to the interview. So don't feel as though you need to do that kind of preparation. We're not after sort of rehearsed answers and pre-prepared speeches on things that you might have written in your personal statement, or topics that you might have covered at school. So from that is a related thing to do in an interview, which is please do answer the question that you have actually been asked. And we will help you. It's not necessarily an easy question. We're going to try and guide you through how to answer that question, and we'll hope that you'll learn something as part of that process. But yeah, I'd probably suggest that will be something to do. Do answer the question. Don't rehearse and plan to give loads and loads of sort of pre-prepared answers. And I suppose the most important piece of advice I can give you is to be you. Don't try and be what you think a Cambridge applicant ought to be and what you think is going to be successful in the room, because we're not looking for a particular background or personality or school type or qualification or nationality or anything else. We're just looking for the strongest students, regardless of where they are in the world and what their journey to Cambridge has been. So simply be you. You'll find that much easier than trying to second guess what other person you ought to be. And we will appreciate that authenticity because it will allow us to better understand your motivation for studying your subject. And how you then convey that as an individual. The great thing about our application process is that we can put the time into seeing you as individuals, and we do. So yeah, just be you, and that will be absolutely fine.
I think it really gives me goosebumps because I was very lucky that I loved my interview experience. After my interview, I remember going and telling my mom that I don't even care if I don't get in because that was one of the best experiences of my life. And just being able to talk to such a successful academic, and as you said, them giving you one-on-one attention, even though you're not even guaranteed a place at their uni, they're still taking our time to talk to you and have an intellectual conversation. It's such a great privilege, and it's likely that you might not have any chance like that in the near future. So I think make the most out of it, but more than that, just enjoy the experience and remind yourself how lucky you are to be sitting there and conversing with someone who's just so cool, is what I kept telling myself. And I think my number one tip is treat the interview as though you're talking to your favorite teacher about your favorite subject. I think if you're at school, you're very comfortable with your teacher, and it's not a one-way discussion. If they're asking you questions, you're curious, you're going to ask them questions back. And I think that's such a nice dynamic to have in an interview because they're not assessing, it's not a one-way assessment. They also want to see your curiosity, which can come through in the sort of questions you ask back, whether it be simply that I don't understand, can you tell me this again, or can you repeat what you said? Or like a follow-up question to something that they asked. Because I remember my interviewer gave me a bit of time at the end to say, do you have any more comments you want to add, or is there anything you want to ask me? And I asked him a tiny follow-up question that I had about something he had asked me. So I think just be you, as you said, and there is no formula for a successful application. I think that's the one overarching message I've received from all of your answers today, Catherine. It's just you do you, and you just have to be authentic and be true to yourself.
That's perfect. If I could just add to one thing that I really loved about what you said there, it's also a privilege for the people who are interviewing you to interview you. We have outstanding applications. It is such a joy to meet you. The interviews are the best fortnight of the year. It's really such a wonderful experience. So I really hope it will be positive for everybody.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I know that, as you said, this is probably one of the most busiest weeks of your entire career year. And I appreciate it so much that you took out this time to come and answer these questions. These are questions that I receive so often, but sometimes I feel that it's much better if someone on the interviewer side answers these questions because there's only so much I can say as someone who's gone through the experience. So I really, really appreciate it. And I'm sure my viewers also will gain a lot from this video. So thank you for the bottom of my heart for coming through, even though I reached out quite last minute. Thank you so much for giving us your time. It was lovely having you today with us.
Well, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to come and talk. I've really, really enjoyed it. And thank you for your insights too. I think you've got a lot to offer your channel.